In 2013, the Center for Sustainable Shale Development issued performance standards for gas extraction. A number of experts have reviewed these standards for the Delaware Riverkeeper Network and have issued a report saying the guidelines fail to protect the environment and human health. Hydrologist Tom Myers examined the standards for monitoring and protecting groundwater.
If you're going to have a standard, it has to be protective in the long term. And the only way a standard will be protective is if it considers all potential pathways and monitors for a long enough time. I mean, it's better to, prevention is the best way. I mean, monitoring is only documenting the degradation. You have to have a plan of what to do with it once you've documented it. And they do not require that in this standard. They talk a little bit about, what to do with it, but there's no plan to clean it up, and it's best to avoid creating a mess that needs cleaned up in the first place, because groundwater remediation is extremely expensive, and what you end up doing is just replacing a water supply, but you have a dead aquifer. Well, there were two standards that I looked at the most. One of them has to do with the area that they would do a review on, and none of the tests that they would perform would show that the natural geology would keep the fracking fluid from reaching surface waters, or keep methane, or keep natural brine from polluting groundwater. Basically, their studies were not going to be, the required studies were neither over a large enough area nor extensive enough. Well, groundwater monitoring, for one, they only ask that you look at existing water wells. Domestic water wells are not designed for groundwater monitoring for a variety of reasons. They're often screened over too large of an area, which means the open area, they can draw water from several different parts of an aquifer. Whereas a monitoring well, you want it to tell you what part of the aquifer is contaminated. So the other problem is they're not going to monitor, they don't go through and determine any predicted potential pathways for the contaminants to go. When you do a monitoring well, you should figure out where the contaminants are most likely to go and monitor that, as opposed to simply monitoring some of the domestic wells, because once a domestic well is contaminated, it's too late. Monitoring is about catching something before it gets there and before you contaminate the water source. And then finally, they aren't monitoring it for a long enough time. I believe they're only recommending 1 or 2 samples after fracking occurs. Well, fracking fluid, if it's moving from the well bore or deep underground, may take 10 or 20 years, and it's just as toxic in 10 or 20 years as it is if it gets there in 6 months. I mean, so this is a long-term issue that they need, that one would need to monitor for, and that's what these standards fail to do. Well, they called their area of review, which is areas that they would do a geologic review, including looking for abandoned wells and stuff like that, was only going to be along the well bores within I believe it was within 2,500 feet, and what does not account for the possibility of the contamination moving along the formations horizontally and then hitting fractures and going vertically. That's how it's going to get there. It's not going to come straight up from a well bore. It's not going to go straight from a well bore to a domestic well. It's going to follow rather tortuous pathways. The geologic formations are laid more or less horizontally, and the contaminants are going to go horizontal, hit a fracture, go up, maybe hit another fracture, go horizontal, and then go up. I should say hit another formation and then between fractures. It's going to follow a tortuous pathway, and it may take a period of time. I mean, we see, well, some of the contamination we see, especially with methane gas, has occurred up to more than a mile away from the nearest well, and it's very much linked to the fracking operations, and so a kilometer, that would be the bare minimum they should consider. but that's only for one type of contamination. That is gas following some of the shorter pathways. Well, Pennsylvania's setback requirements for how far you should you should stay away from a stream or a water source or a domestic well are quite small. I mean, they're quite variable, so it's hard for me to say the number is this. But in some cases, it's for the most part less than 600 feet, as I recall all of the setback standards. It is very possible for a well next to a fracking site to not be contaminated, but a well 3 times further away to be contaminated because the groundwater flows through fractures. It's very possible for the fracture to bypass the first well and hit the next well down the way, and it can happen very fast. Different contaminants have different properties as they flow through the ground. They're not really requiring any monitoring of any of the, well, they're not requiring them to say that this is what we're using for fracking fluid, therefore we should monitor for these contaminants. I believe they are requiring, they're suggesting that they will look for a suite of some organic chemicals, but they're not being specific to what's going underground, and I mean, so they're not being very specific that way. Some of these organics will attenuate very quickly. That means that they'll absorb to the soil, absorb to the rocks. Some will flow much further. They really should perhaps start doing things like using a tracer. You know, that way we would know who's causing what problem. I mean, that's a suggestion. That goes beyond my review, but it's some type of thing that a standard. If you're going to use a standard to raise the bar, let's figure out who's, you know, if there's a dozen wells being put in, and someone comes up with a contaminated water well, they can point the finger at all dozen wells, you know, and you don't know who's causing it. Some kind of a tracer might be useful in that instance. It's used in other fields of natural resources. It's not necessarily, unfortunately, it's not used initially. I mean, with mining, there you're not actively injecting a waste into the ground. I mean, the difference between fracking and most kinds of natural resource development is you are taking a toxic substance and injecting it into groundwater. Maybe not considered a source of drinking water where there's injecting it, but it can flow into a source of drinking water. Something like a mine leak, you don't intend the mine to leak necessarily, so you may not have a tracer in that. But when you're injecting something and you're trying to say, oh, no problem, it's not going to get into a source of drinking water, well, let's just put a substance in there, a conservative tracer that would allow them to identify that Company A caused this problem. They're not taking into consideration what the actual pathways are, and that's perhaps my biggest beef. Is they're just saying, let's just look at the closest water sources and be done with it, and look at it for a very short time period. Groundwater contamination can take a long time to occur and can be very devastating once it builds up to that point. They're not watching it for long enough. I mean, a good example, and it's not for fracking, but you can go to the state of Montana and they require you to monitor for 100 years after, for potential leakage from mines. The leakage from fracking sites can go just as, you know, can occur just as long and can be just as devastating, just as toxic as that coming from mine sites. And so, so I guess I would sum that up by saying, you know, proper groundwater practice would be to look at what the pathways could be, what the sources are, the wells, what the receptors are. That would be the drinking water wells, the streams, the springs that you want to protect, and how can it get from point A to point B. These standards don't require them to look at that at all, with the possible exception of saying, are there any abandoned wells? But they don't even require them to go on the ground and look for abandoned wells. They only say, look at state maps, and if the map shows there might be wells there, then you go find it on the ground, but they're not required. But the state acknowledges there's thousands of wells that are not in their database, so they will likely miss that.